This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, starts the show discussing legal and tax issues that agriculture producers could be looking into due to the recent Prairie fires. K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan keeps the show rolling as she highlights frost seeding legumes and why this option could be beneficial and factors to remember. Ending the show is the Beef Cattle Institute with part of their Cattle Chat podcast as they chat about what they recommend looking into when filtering through cattle buying prospects. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show discussing legal and tax issues associated with prairie fires. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Roger, are there often a lot of legal and tax issues associated with prairie fires?
Oh, there sure are. And some of these people that have recently been hit with these prairie fires were hit about 8 years ago out in the Ashland area, and it's just devastating for them. But fortunately, the tax code and state law also has some helpful provisions when you have disasters like this that occur.
I'm going to talk through a few of those different options and provisions. First one involving forced sale rules, and how does this matter to a producer?
Well, when you have wildfires that destroy grazing land, you might find yourself in a situation where you have to sell cattle early because there's just no pastures left to graze them on or no rangeland, at least temporarily, until things grow back. And the tax code does have two primary mechanisms to manage the resulting tax spike because, again, if you're going to sell excess livestock more than you normally would in that particular tax year, that could generate some additional income and bump you up into a higher tax bracket. So one of the tools is that you can use a one-year deferral rule. If you're on the cash method of accounting, you can make an election to defer the income from your livestock sold in excess of the normal business practice for that year. And as long as the area is designated for federal assistance, whether by the president or by the Secretary of Agriculture due to the fire, you can qualify for this. But again, deferral only applies to the number of heads sold above your 3-year average.
What's the other option?
Well, the other option is known as the involuntary conversion rule. So if you have draft, dairy, or breeding animals, not feeder calves, you can defer the gain entirely if you replace the livestock within a specific time frame. And generally, that's 2 years, but it's 4 years if the area gets a federal disaster designation, and I'm sure this will. And if that area would continue to experience drought, for example, or some type of event that's linked to the wildfire risk, that period can get extended beyond 4 years. So the IRS will often link drought to wildfire risks if the fire destroyed forage, effectively creating a drought-like lack of feed. So basically 4 years to replace, but it could be extended further.
So when it comes to replacing these animals, if they sold a replacement female, do they need to replace that replacement female with the same thing?
That's right. They have to be functionally similar. That's a good point. So you've got to replace breeding cows with breeding cows. You can't use the proceeds to, for example, to buy a tractor.
And another big thing when we're thinking about fires and destruction, fences, and what are some tax issues with that?
You may have wooden posts that have been destroyed, so your fences have been destroyed. Now, I am aware that in the Ashland area that was burned a number of years ago, that some of the ranchers there replaced with steel posts, and so they'll have less of a damage with respect to fences. But it does create some issues from a tax standpoint because a lot of these fences, Shelby, have been depreciated out. So you put up a new fence as a result of the fire 7 or 8 years ago, and you maybe bonused that out or you took Section 179, but whatever you did, or maybe even standard maker's depreciation under 7-year rules, and you don't have any basis left in that fence. So if the fire destroys the fence and you don't have any income tax basis in it, then your deductible tax loss is zero, and your expenses paid to replace the damaged fence cannot be deducted as a current loss. And so the only deduction that you would claim in that situation is what you haven't already written off through depreciation. But my guess is that's going to be very low or non-existent. And any reconstruction of a fence that's been entirely destroyed by fire, IRS is going to say that's a capital improvement. That's not a repair. And so you don't get a current deduction for the rebuild. It's going to be added to the fence's basis and then depreciated out over time. Now, if it's a minor fix, so maybe I'm replacing a few burnt posts, those are deductible in the current year as an ordinary business expense. You're going to have to make that distinction, but we can offset the immediate cost of a destroyed fence with the ramp up in Section 179 under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or now we've got 100% bonus depreciation again.
How does insurance play into this?
Well, if you got insurance on a destroyed or damaged fence, if those proceeds exceed your basis, that's going to trigger gain. So again, we go back to probably these fences don't have any income tax basis in it. And if you get insurance proceeds for that, that's all going to be taxable gain. But that gain might be avoided by treating the destruction as an involuntary conversion and then simply reinvesting the insurance proceeds into the new fence.
If a building was destroyed, how does that play into property value and impact producers?
Well, if we've got a business property such as a ranch, you're going to have to calculate the loss for each unit. And typically, the IRS will look at this as a single identifiable property, or a SIP, as we call it. And that's the specific tract of land that's affected. So in the case of a ranch, the land and the improvements, meaning they're the fences and corrals, they're often treated as separate, single identifiable properties. So the taxpayer has to compare the land's adjusted basis with the decline in the fair market value of the property. And then the deduction is the lesser of those two numbers.
How does that impact then what it might be appraised for?
That's another really good question. Valuing scorched land will require an appraisal. And so that appraiser is going to look at what a willing buyer would pay for scorched earth versus healthy pasture. And often that value is going to drop because the buyer can't run cattle on it for 1 to 2 growing seasons. And so sometimes the cost of the repairs, so I mean reseeding or erosion control or debris removal, those costs can be used as a proxy for the decline in the fair market value. But the IRS will only allow that if the repairs are necessary to restore the land to its pre-casualty condition and the amount that you spend is not excessive.
How do they identify what is necessary?
Let's say that you've got an appraiser that determines a fire caused, for example, a $200,000 decline in value, but the tax basis in the land is $50,000. So there you're going to get a maximum tax deduction of $50,000. You're not going to get the full $200,000 loss that's incurred. Now, what's necessary to restore the land? That's often going to be tied into those numbers. So what is necessary to bring the land back to its pre-casualty condition? That's how we're going to determine whether that's excessive or not. And again, measuring the decline in the value tied to the tax basis is one way we figure out what is reasonable.
How does that then impact property taxes?
Well, again, and Kansas and Oklahoma have 2 different provisions on this. And the fire, of course, started in Oklahoma and came into Kansas. Federal income tax is tied to basis, but state property tax is tied to productivity. And that's particularly the case in Kansas. Kansas values ag land based on productivity potential, not market value. So if you've got a fire that's destroyed the landlord's share of net income, for example, then the county appraiser can be petitioned, and in Kansas that has to be by April 15, for a valuation adjustment. Now, Oklahoma, they have a constitutional cap on how much a property's assessed value can increase, and that's 3 to 5% annually. So if the fire causes the market value to drop below the capped value, property taxes in Oklahoma should decrease proportionally.
What other options are available potentially for producers?
Well, the USDA's got a number of programs involving disaster assistance. They've got the livestock indemnity program that's going to provide payment for livestock deaths that exceeded normal mortality rate that were caused by the fire. There's the emergency assistance for livestock program, or ELAP. That'll cover the cost of hauling water or feed to livestock and the cost of transporting livestock to new grazing land. Then there's the Emergency Conservation Program, or ECP. That provides funding to repair fences and water facilities that were destroyed by the fire. So as long as you've got good, reliable records of your livestock deaths and the casualty that was caused, and you've got photos and veterinary certifications or maybe rendering plant receipts, that's all going to be helpful when it comes to these government programs. But failure to document your losses immediately can lead to legal denials of the claim. So you got to be diligent and make sure you keep good records and keep good photo evidence of what happened to you with respect to the fire.
So as we're looking at all this, what are your key takeaways for producers?
Well, key takeaways are that I think there are a lot of technical tax issues that farmers and ranchers are going to have that were affected by the fire on their 2026 tax return. So, as I mentioned, keeping good evidence of what you went through and understanding how to handle repair costs and what is deductible and what is not, so that you can project your cash flow and your financial needs. And so, you need to be talking to your tax professionals now on that side of things. And then, of course, you've got liability and property law issues. So if animals that survived the fire now are wandering around because the fences were destroyed, again, the rule in Kansas as well as in Oklahoma is you're not going to necessarily be liable if there's an accident because somebody hits them out on the road. The injured party is going to have to prove that you were negligent somehow. And that's going to be an uphill climb for an injured party in this type of situation, this type of a disaster. You weren't negligent in having your animals get out. It was something that was beyond your control. And then keep in mind any state-specific incentives. There are some state incentives to knock off state sales tax for repairing materials used to repair fences, those types of things. So lots of things to think about. And I would say, again, I'm emphasizing talk to your tax professionals, make sure they're aware of what you've gone through, and so they can get you some projections as to how this might affect your cash flow, depending on what the tax provisions are that you want to utilize on your 26 return.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. I will link a blog article on this topic in today's show notes on agtoday.net if you'd like to read more. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing an e-update article titled Frost Seeding Legumes into Established Cool Season Forages with K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan. Tina, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
Tina, what is frost seeding?
So when we think about frost seeding, this would be broadcasting some kind of seed into typically an established stand of, in this case, we're going to be talking about cool season forages such as smooth brome grass or tall fescue. And we're broadcasting that legume seed to kind of be pulled into the soil via the freezing and thawing cycle of the winter. So we don't have to use equipment that way, say if we were no-tilling or minimum tillage into a field, especially if it's an already established field. We don't want to really run equipment over it, because yes, it costs diesel fuel to do that, but also we're introducing more compaction when we do that. So that's where this frost seeding of a legume can come into. We're going to increase our palatability of our forage, help lengthen our grazing season, especially in those fields that maybe it's a lot more tall fescue. Adding something like a legume can help with the fescue toxiosis. And also when we add a legume into these cool seasons, we can get some nitrogen credits from them once those legumes are established. So don't expect nitrogen credits that first year of after establishment. Kind of let them get going.
What are some different legume options?
So when we think about the legumes that we can use, typically the most successful are going to be your crimson, your red, and then your white or ladino clovers. One little caveat with crimson clover, it is more of an annual clover, whereas red clover and the white or ladino are your perennials. The red clover is actually that more purpley, really big flower we think about when it comes to bumblebees sitting on them. And then white or ladino are a little bit smaller white clovers. Crimson, again, it's an annual. It still produces a good amount of forage, but it's not going to have that longevity of red versus white or ladino. And then we have some other legumes like bird's foot trefoil, chicory, annual, and Korean lespedeza. These are not the noxious lespedezas. These are the more forage palatable ones. They have a mixed ability to work into this frost seeding, and also something like bird's foot trefoil does not like being cut or grazed. So if we're going to hay it or have livestock on it, the longevity of that bird's foot trefoil will be diminished. We do not recommend using this frost seeding practice with a legume like alfalfa.
Are the cool season forages ever too dense to where that frost seeding and that broadcast seeding wouldn't work?
I'm never going to say there's not going to be a stand that's too thick, but the reality is we are going in when those forages are typically more dormant. When we frost seed these legumes in, the legumes start to pop up, so there shouldn't be as much competitiveness between them. But really, the only time we're not going to see good seed to soil contact in this frost seeding environment is if maybe that fescue, maybe that smooth brome was just way too tall when it was going into the winter dormancy. Most of the time, I'm not seeing stands that are above 8 to 10 inches tall. If they are, I'm glad you have that much forage. If you're going to frost seed into it, maybe consider mowing, or if you have the ability to put livestock out there, to go ahead and graze off a lot of that extra material, because it also will promote that cool season forage as we go into the season to promote more growth.
Is there any concern for animals coming and picking up the little seeds?
Anytime we introduce more seed into a field, there is always a risk of birds coming in. That's not something we can really avoid, no matter what kind, whether we're putting grass seed or legume seed. That's why when we're working in these frost seeded situations where the seed's going to be more broadcast, we're waiting on that frost to freezing cycle to pull it in, we do typically increase those planting rates just to ensure we have enough seed out there. So can we avoid animals picking up the seed? No, we can't keep birds off the field. But just being aware that, yeah, you may have some seed loss, but you're going to have seed loss anytime you're planting a small seed like a grass seed or a legume seed.
And what is that planting rate that you recommend?
So we would typically think in terms of crimson or red clover, 6 to 8 pounds. And if we're mixing it, especially with white Lalodino, 3 to 4 pounds. If you feel as though you might not have the best conditions when you're planting, bump up those planting rates for red or crimson clover, maybe go up to 10 pounds, and for white or ladino up to 6 to 8. I understand that seed costs are expensive, but if we're going to be doing this, we want to put our best foot forward and put as much seed out there as we can the first go around, because anytime we got to run anything over a field, it does cost money.
And should these seeds be treated?
Yes, anytime we are working with the legume, we want them treated. We want the rhizobia on them. We want them inoculated. Because when we think about inoculation, whether it was back into talking about soybeans or we're talking about clovers or alfalfa, we want to make sure we have the correct rhizobia, so for that nitrogen fixation. If your field has been monoculture, tall fescue, brome, etc. for quite a while, those rhizobia do not last they're not there anymore. So you need that seed treatment on there, aka the inoculum. It's very hard to actually find really any of our clover seeds without inoculum, because it is it's a practice of, we have insurance on that seed then.
Do growers need to check their soil fertility before they go about this frost seeding?
If we want to get the best bang out of our butt for, purchasing clover seeds, then we want to make sure we are growing them in their best conditions. Whereas our grasses can handle some soil fertility, especially our pH pretty low, thinking as it goes into a 5, or they can handle some low phosphorus, potassium. If we're going to be spending the money on the legumes, let's go ahead and double check our pH, right? And if we do see our pH, our P and K levels are pretty low, especially if our pH is ticking towards a 6, those legumes are not going to establish as well. If the legumes were already established and our pH starts to tick lower, it can handle, especially in clovers. But if we're going to spend the money on clover seed and trying to turn what typically is a monoculture grass stand into this more diverse grazing system or forage system, let's go ahead and take the time to make sure our fertility is in the right before we just throw seed out there and wonder why it never came up.
How long do you see this frost seeding of legumes take to get established?
There's not a perfect answer here. Sometimes when we go spread the seed, surely how many those frost days do we have that freezing and thawing effect to pull the seed to the soil really well to get that seed to soil contact? Also, moisture, right? If we don't have adequate moisture, especially when we think about these warm days and kind of more limited snowpack, we might not have as much moisture in that first few inches of the profile. The seed aren't going to go anywhere, but they might not also just pop up instantly. Don't say like after a few months, oh, this was a failure. The seed can also hang out for a bit. It's waiting for those opportune moisture events. So I don't have an exact answer. No one really does when it comes to this frost seeding of, was this, did we do good? Did we not do good? And that's also going to affect the longevity of those clovers in a stand. Because when we are putting clover or any of these legumes into a forage stand that's already been well established, we're going to see some competitiveness from them. We may see more grass some years. We may see more clover some years. It's a system that's going to have to balance itself out.
Are there any weed management considerations for growers to take into consideration?
For the longest time, when we thought about these, mixed stands of a broadleaf that is a legume going into a grass stand, we did think about a lot of our herbicide options being far more limited. Because let's think about like 2,4-D, Graze-On, Pasture Guard. Those are broadleaf killers. So if we're putting them over the top of a grass pasture, we're probably going to kill out those broadleaves. But what we have seen over time is some of our broadleaf herbicides seem to be a bit safer on clovers, especially our perennial clovers like Ladino or white, once they get established. There's lots of work that suggests once that clover has established itself, it's got a good little root system, it's got its little colony of rhizobia, it can handle our herbicide application. If we're going to spray for, say, this is a pasture that has a lot of very undesirable broadleaves and we just frost seeded, we're likely going to smoke out those clovers that we just tried to get established. So thinking about what is the makeup of that pasture or that forage stand, right? If you historically have some pretty nasty weeds and are really wanting to do some kind of clover introduction, maybe we need to knock back the weeds before we spend the money on the clover seed or any of those legume seeds, because it does add a complexity to the herbicide, to the weed management side. Anytime we go from a true monoculture, thinking a pure grass stand, to something else, we mix in those broadleaves and our grasses, we complex the situation because there's not going to be a single product that is fully safe for one of the two.
Tina, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan. I will link this e-update article in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Wednesday show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, Dustin Pendle, Christian Magana, Jason Warner, and Phil Plancaster.
If I am in the market to purchase a bull, I want to think about some of the things that would be considerations for purchasing that bull, because there's so much information available. How do I filter that information down to make it usable? Bob, I'll start with you.
Well, I'm going to start with somebody else is going to talk about EPDs and the genetic potential for those bulls' offspring. But you got to start with the bull. And is he fertile? Are his feet and legs sound? Is he able to do the job of getting cows bred? So to me, you really should start with, is he able to do his job, which is to get cows bred?
Yeah, I think that's the first thing he's got to be able to do. And a lot of times there's an assessment before the sale, most sales, that he's passed that BSE. Dustin, from your perspective?
Yeah, I was going to say, I would assume that you've already done all that. And so I guess I'm going to probably come in and say, okay, here's my budget. And then from there, what characteristics are going to fit my particular environment and operation? That's what I'll probably try to target.
Now, Christian, I didn't introduce you well. So you're manager purebred unit here at K-State. And then I want to get your perspective on what you're looking for.
Mainly when I'm looking at a bull and, trying to select, and especially, for me trying to make breeding decisions and everything that comes along with getting ready for a sale, I think the big thing is, obviously EPDs are a really good tool, but they're not the whole picture, not the whole story, to where, for me, I really like to go back and look at the dam, the grand dam, make sure those are good, sound cows that, are proven, and they have maybe other offspring that have produced herd sires before, or making sure that they're breeding up every year, make sure they've got good bags, good feet, good structure, good soundness, just kind of all those things. And then also, too, going and looking at, if that sire has already had a couple of calf crops on the ground, making sure that those are good calves. He has good progeny, proven progeny, as to where, maybe some other bulls are a little bit newer that are a little unproven. The same thing goes for sire groups, too, because not every bull at the sale is going to be, a unique sire. So just trying to make sure that you're going and kind of doing your homework. And, a lot of those sale catalogs will include pictures of the dams to go along with, especially if there's a big ET program there, that you go back and you look at those dams and make sure that they kind of have a good proven track record.
Yeah, excellent. And I think that's an important topic as we think about the EPDs, is trying to predict how this bull is going to perform, but also looking back at his lineage provides some other information and finding out how his dams have been in the herd.
Well, I think, and Jason, you can jump in here and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you'll have accuracies published in a lot of those catalogs along with the EPDs, right? And so some of those things you're talking about, Christian, like that he's got some progeny on the ground already, or he's part of a proven line, that those type of things are going to help improve that accuracy. So when you're buying a bull, don't just look at the EPD number, look at the accuracy that goes along with it. The higher that accuracy, the more sure we are that EPD is really what he's going to pass on to his progeny.
Yeah, absolutely, Philip. And that's where you kind of think back to several years ago when we were just primarily working with our basic EPDs that we had. And, whatever we had for that bull based on his pedigree and other half siblings that he might have registered is going to influence what that accuracy number looked like. And I remember a lot of times it was 0.05, 0.03, something like that. And so now, as our genomic tests have improved over the course of time, and we've tied that into our valuation metrics and into these EPDs, we're able to increase that accuracy so much more. And so that has a lot of value for folks to be able to make those decisions with much more confidence than what previously we've been able to do so with where we are now. But absolutely, we have a lot of information out there for folks to be able to really kind of work through and decipher through.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. You can listen to the full episode by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.